It was an ordinary day in the small town of Ridgewood, a place where everyone knew each other's name and news traveled fast. The kind of town where the sun seemed to set with a golden glow over the rolling hills and quiet farms, and the slow hum of everyday life provided a comforting sense of normalcy. But for Jake Kingston, that normalcy was beginning to feel like a prison. Jake, the 25-year-old son of the wealthiest family in town, had grown up with every luxury imaginable: sprawling estates, the best education, and every material possession one could desire. Yet despite all of it, he felt disconnected, like something crucial was missing from his life. The pressure to live up to his family's legacy weighed on him like a 1,000-ton stone, and the daily expectations of taking over his father's multi-million-dollar corporation seemed more like a suffocating cage than an exciting opportunity. That day, like many others, Jake found himself aimlessly driving his expensive sports car down the winding country roads that bordered the Kingston estate. He wasn't really going anywhere. He just needed to be alone, to escape the constant reminders of the life his father expected him to lead. As he cruised past the familiar fields, his mind wandered, not to the corporate meetings awaiting him in the city, but to something entirely different, a sense of longing for something real, something simple, something that didn't come with strings attached. It was a question he had been grappling with for years. Is this really all there is? Meanwhile, Emma Carter was going about her usual routine on the farm she had grown up on, just a few miles down the road from the Kingston estate. A 22-year-old with dirt under her nails and calluses on her hands, Emma's life had always been about hard work. Unlike Jake, she wasn't born into luxury. Her family had spent generations working the land, eking out a living from the crops and livestock that sustained them. Her father, a stoic, weathered man, had raised her with one goal in mind: survival. Emma had never complained. She loved the farm, loved the rhythm of life that came with each season, but she also knew the limitations it placed on her. The world outside the farm was vast, full of opportunities she had never tasted. For years, she dreamed of leaving, of finding something bigger than the life she had been handed. But that was a far-off dream, something that could only exist in her imagination. That afternoon, Emma was walking along the dirt road that led to the small market where she sold the farm's produce. She carried a basket of fresh tomatoes, her heart heavy with the weight of her father's latest news. The farm's debts had reached an all-time high. The bank had made it clear that if they didn't make a significant payment soon, they would lose everything. Emma's mind raced with worry. What would happen to her family if they lost the farm? Would they have to move into town? She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain: she had to find a way to help. The harsh reality of her situation pulled at her chest, tightening like a vice. She couldn't bear to see her father struggle any longer. That's when the incident happened, an accident that would change everything. Jake had been driving too fast, lost in his thoughts, when the sound of screeching tires jerked him back to reality. He slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. A truck, Emma's truck, had swerved in front of him. There was a sickening crunch of metal as the two vehicles collided. Jake's heart raced as he scrambled out of the car, panic rising in his chest. The dust from the collision hung in the air, and the smell of burning rubber stung his nostrils. He could barely make out the figure of a woman stumbling out of the wrecked truck. "Are you okay?" Jake's voice was shaky as he rushed toward her. Emma, dazed but not seriously injured, stood up and dusted herself off. Her heart was pounding from the shock of the crash, but she quickly glanced over at her truck. It was a mess. Her father had worked so hard to get it running smoothly, and now it was totaled. Her world seemed to momentarily stop spinning as she assessed the damage. I'm fine," she managed to say, though she could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "But my truck." Jake looked at the wreckage, his gaze shifting back to her. "Let me help you. I'll cover the repairs. It's the least I can do." Emma looked at him, unsure of what to make of the situation. She hadn't recognized him at first, but now that she looked closely, She saw the familiar name on the side of the car. Kingston. Of course, she thought. The son of the richest man in town. Her mind was racing, but she couldn't help but feel a strange connection to this man who, despite his wealth and status, was offering her help in such a casual, almost genuine way. "No, thank you," she replied, her voice firm despite the confusion. "I don't need charity." Jake blinked, taken aback. He had been offering to help out of instinct, not realizing that his gesture could be seen as anything other than kindness. But there was something about the way she stood, so self-assured despite the circumstances, that caught his attention. "I wasn't offering charity, just a way to fix the situation," he said, his tone softer this time. Emma paused. She hadn't expected this. Most people, especially those with money like Jake, would have assumed she'd just accept the offer. But there was something in her that refused to let her pride be swallowed by someone else's wealth. She knew the farm depended on her, and she couldn't risk anyone thinking she was too weak to handle things on her own. But as they stood there in the middle of the road, something shifted between them. It wasn't just the accident. It was the way they saw each other, the realization that, despite their differences, they were both at a crossroads in life. There was no going back from this moment. Jake Kingston, the wealthy, privileged son of a businessman, had found himself connected to Emma Carter, a farmer's daughter with dreams too big for the life she had been handed. Little did either of them know that this chance encounter would spark something neither could ever have predicted. Over the next few days, Jake couldn't get Emma out of his mind. He kept replaying the moment of the crash over and over in his head, the look on her face when she'd refused his help, her eyes steady, yet somehow filled with something he couldn't quite place. He admired her stubbornness, the way she stood her ground even in the face of an accident. It was different from the people he was used to, who would have eagerly accepted help, maybe even out of a sense of obligation. But Emma, she was different. He had expected her to be grateful, to see him as a lifeline, but instead, she'd shut him out. And somehow, that intrigued him. Meanwhile, Emma couldn't stop thinking about Jake either. She'd been skeptical at first, wondering if his offer had been a momentary lapse in judgment, an attempt to appease his guilt for causing the crash. She had no interest in being part of the wealthy world he came from. After all, it wasn't just about money. It was about the lifestyle, the expectations, and the people who would never understand the kind of struggle she'd faced. But there was something about Jake that seemed different. When he offered to help, it wasn't with the usual condescension she had come to expect from the rich. He hadn't acted like he was doing her a favor. He had simply offered a solution. She respected that in a strange way. It didn't take long before Jake found a reason to reach out to her. One afternoon, a week after the accident, he showed up at the farm unannounced. He'd been talking to his father's team of mechanics, and he had arranged for the truck to be repaired at no cost. He had expected Emma to be angry with him again, but something told him he needed to follow through, even if she didn't appreciate it. Emma stood at the edge of the field, wiping the sweat from her brow as she watched Jake pull into the gravel driveway. Her first instinct was to turn and walk away, to pretend she hadn't seen him, but something held her in place. He wasn't wearing his usual suit and tie. Today he was in jeans and a t-shirt, his sleeves rolled up, his hair tousled from the wind. He looked, for the first time, like a man who had stepped out of his world and into hers. Jake stepped out of the car and waved, a sheepish grin on his face. "I know you don't like being helped, but I couldn't just let the truck go to waste. It's all fixed now, ready to go." Emma crossed her arms over her chest, eyeing him with suspicion. "I told you before, I don't want your charity." Jake nodded, understanding her reluctance. "I'm not here to force anything on you, Emma. I just want to make sure you're okay. The truck's been repaired, no strings attached. I promise." She took a deep breath, torn between accepting the gesture and maintaining her independence. Finally, she gave in, her shoulders relaxing just a little. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice softer than before. It wasn't easy for her to admit, but she couldn't deny that the truck being fixed meant one less thing to worry about. Jake smiled, relieved to see her guard drop, even if just a little. I know you don't need anyone coming in to save the day, but sometimes it's just about finding a way to help. We're neighbors, after all. He paused, taking a step closer. And if you ever need anything else, just ask. No pressure. I won't force you to take anything you don't want. For a moment, there was an uncomfortable silence between them. Emma looked at him, her gaze flickering back and forth between him and the now repaired truck. She had never expected someone like Jake to show up at her doorstep, let alone offer help without expecting anything in return. It was strange, almost too good to be true. I guess I didn't expect you to actually follow through, she said, her voice tinged with surprise. Jake chuckled softly. Yeah, well, I'm not really used to people turning me down. But you're different. Emma raised an eyebrow. Different how? I don't know, Jake shrugged, looking out over the field. I guess I've never really had to earn someone's trust before. I'm used to things being handed to me. But with you, he trailed off, unsure of how to finish his thought. I just want to make sure you don't think I'm like the others. Emma studied him for a moment, unsure of what to make of his words. Was he genuinely trying to connect with her, or was this just some kind of attempt at making himself feel better? I don't really know what you want, Jake, she said finally, but I'm not someone who's going to be impressed by your name or your money. Jake's expression softened, a look of genuine understanding passing across his face. I know. That's why I'm here. I don't want you to be impressed by anything other than who I really am. Emma hesitated before speaking again. I don't need you to prove anything to me. I've spent my whole life working for what I have, and I don't know how to accept things without feeling like I owe someone. Jake nodded. I get it. Believe me, I do. I don't expect anything from you. I just want to be here, to help if you ever need it. There was an awkward pause, and then Emma gave a small, reluctant smile. Well, I guess I'll take the truck back then, she said, her tone lightening just a little. But that's all. No more favors, okay? Jake laughed, his voice light and genuine. No more favors, I promise. As she walked over to the truck, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. It wasn't just the truck, or the help he'd offered. It was the way he saw her, not as a charity case, not as someone to pity, but as someone who could stand on her own. For the first time in a long while, she felt like someone had finally looked past the surface and tried to understand her. It wasn't something she was used to, but it felt nice. And for Jake, it was the first time in years that he felt truly seen, not as the son of a rich businessman, not as someone who had everything handed to him, but as a person who wanted something more from life, something real. Emma was a reminder that not everything in the world could be bought, not every connection could be manipulated, and for the first time, he wondered what his life could be like if he chose to live it differently. As the days turned into weeks, Jake and Emma's paths continued to cross, each encounter drawing them closer in ways neither of them had anticipated. What started as a simple, chance meeting had begun to evolve into something more complex, a bond neither could ignore. At first, their conversations had been guarded, filled with polite exchanges about the weather, the farm, and his family's business. But as time passed, something shifted. The walls they had both built around themselves began to crumble, piece by piece. Jake found himself stopping by the farm more often, though he never forced his presence. He'd help with the odd task, fixing a fence, carrying bags of feed, even learning how to properly tend to the animals under Emma's watchful eye. Every time he pulled up to the farm, a strange sense of peace washed over him. It was nothing like the manic hustle of his life in the city or the endless corporate meetings. Here he could breathe. Here he wasn't Jake Kingston, the millionaire's son with an inheritance to inherit and a business to run. He was just Jake, trying to make sense of who he was and what he wanted. And when he was with Emma, he felt like he was truly living, like every moment was grounded in something real and tangible. Emma, on the other hand, couldn't help but feel conflicted. She had grown up with a certain mindset. Wealth and privilege were things to be wary of, things that could easily corrupt a person. She had seen it in the way the wealthy people around her often treated her family with indifference, as though their hard work didn't matter, as though their lives were less important. So when Jake started showing up regularly, offering his help without expecting anything in return, it was hard for her to reconcile that with the world she knew. Could someone like him truly understand the life she led? Could someone raised in luxury truly see the value of a life spent working the land? But the more she watched him, the more she saw something different. Jake was not like the others she had encountered. He didn't flaunt his wealth. He didn't talk about his family's power or influence. He didn't ask for anything in return. In fact, he seemed uncomfortable in the world he came from. She saw the frustration in his eyes when he mentioned his father's expectations, the way he often looked out at the fields, as if imagining a life where he could do something meaningful. Emma found herself beginning to trust him, to see a side of Jake that no one else had ever seen. He was more than just the sum of his money and his family's name. And yet, the doubt lingered, the nagging question that kept her from fully letting her guard down. Was he just playing at something different? Was he really here for her? Or was this just another phase in his life that he'd soon grow tired of? The turning point came one evening when Jake invited Emma to dinner at a local restaurant. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, cozy place in town where the food was simple but good. But for Emma, the invitation felt significant. She had always been cautious of places like this, the places where money and status seemed to hold the most value. She wasn't sure she was ready for the world Jake came from, but there was something about the way he looked at her when he asked that made her hesitate. Maybe, just maybe, she was ready to find out more about the person he truly was. The evening was filled with small talk at first. They both fell into a comfortable rhythm, the conversation flowing effortlessly between them. Jake talked about his childhood, his strained relationship with his father, his struggle to find his own identity amidst the legacy of his family's business. Emma shared stories of her own, of growing up on the farm, of the quiet moments she spent in the fields, of the joy and the exhaustion that came with a life rooted in hard work. But as the night went on, the conversation grew more personal. They began to open up in ways neither had expected, sharing fears, hopes, and dreams they had never voiced before. "I feel like I've been living someone else's life for so long," Jake confessed, staring into his wine glass. "My father's life, my grandfather's life, the business, the meetings, the parties. I don't know who I am outside of all of that. Every time I try to break away, it's like they pull me back in. I can't seem to escape it." Emma listened intently, her eyes softening as she heard the frustration in his voice. She understood that feeling. She'd spent so much of her life trying to make the farm work, trying to take care of everything, that sometimes she forgot to ask herself what she really wanted. It was easier to push aside her dreams for the sake of practicality, to focus on survival rather than living. "I get it," she said quietly. "Sometimes it feels like the world has decided what your life should look like before you've even had a chance to decide for yourself." Jake looked up at her, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "That's exactly it. And I don't even know if I'm ready to let go of it all. I mean, I've spent my whole life preparing for this role, but every time I look at the life I'm supposed to inherit, I don't want it. I want something real, something that matters." Emma nodded, understanding the weight of those words. She had always lived with the fear of being trapped in a life she didn't choose, a life defined by the farm, by the expectations of her family, and by a future that seemed too small for her. But she had never dared to ask for more, not until now. The conversation lingered between them, a shared moment of vulnerability that neither had expected. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't just the dinner or the shared stories. It was the realization that they were both at a crossroads, unsure of what the future held but willing to take a chance on each other. As the evening drew to a close, they stood outside the restaurant, the cool night air sweeping over them. Jake hesitated for a moment, then spoke, his voice softer than before. "I know this might sound crazy, but would you consider helping me figure this out? I don't know where I'm headed, but I feel like I need someone who's not tied to my family, not tied to their expectations. Someone who can help me see the world differently." Emma studied him for a moment, her heart beating faster than she expected. She hadn't been prepared for the depth of his request, for the rawness of his need. But something in her shifted. She had always dreamed of something more, something beyond the farm, beyond the limitations of her life. Maybe, just maybe, Jake could offer her a glimpse of that world. "I don't know if I can help you figure it all out," she said slowly, "but I'll try. If nothing else, I think we could both use a little guidance in this crazy world." Jake smiled, relief flooding his face. "Thanks, I didn't expect you to say yes." As they walked away from the restaurant, something hung in the air between them, a quiet promise, a shared understanding. They had both taken the first step into uncharted territory, and neither of them knew where it would lead. But for the first time, neither of them felt alone. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. It would change both of their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Weeks passed, and what began as an unlikely friendship between Jake and Emma deepened into something neither of them could ignore. Despite their differences, his wealth and status, her humble roots, the bond they shared became undeniable. The more they spent time together, the more they revealed about their lives, and the more they started to question what they truly wanted from the future. Jake found himself yearning for a life that wasn't dictated by the power and expectations of his family. And Emma began to feel the stirrings of something bigger than the confines of the farm, something she had never allowed herself to dream of. Yet even as their connection grew stronger, both were haunted by the realities of their separate worlds. One afternoon, as they walked through the fields of Emma's farm, Jake took a deep breath, trying to push away the anxiety that had been building inside him. The conversation he had been dreading was upon him. He had already started to feel the pull of his family's expectations once again, the suffocating pressure to step into the life he had been born into. His father had been relentless, calling more frequently, demanding his presence at meetings and events, pressing him to take the reins of the business. Jake's attempts to escape the weight of it all were growing more futile with each passing day. "Emma," Jake began, his voice serious, "I've been thinking about something." Emma, who had been lost in thought herself, glanced at him. "What's on your mind?" "I can't keep ignoring my family's demands," he said quietly, the words feeling heavier than he expected. "I have responsibilities, obligations. I know you've seen how much pressure they put on me to take over the company." Emma nodded, sensing where this was going. She had seen the strain on Jake's face every time his father's name came up, every time he had to cancel their plans or make an excuse to leave early. It was always the same. Duty over personal choice. "I get it, Jake," she said softly, "but you don't have to do anything you don't want to. You have the power to choose your own path." Jake shook his head. "It's not that simple. My father, he's made it clear that if I don't step up, I'll lose everything. All the work, all the legacy. I can't just walk away from that." Emma stopped walking and turned to face him, her eyes searching his face. She had always admired his strength, but she could see the doubt in his eyes now, the fear of what might happen if he made the wrong decision. "Jake, you don't have to choose between your family's business and your happiness. You're not your father's shadow. You're not bound by what he wants for you. If you let him dictate your life, you'll always be living for someone else." Jake looked down, his thoughts swirling. It was hard to let go of a life that had been so meticulously planned for him, a life where every move had been calculated to ensure success. He had always been told that money and power were the ultimate goals, but he had come to realize that wasn't the life he wanted. The more time he spent with Emma, the more he saw the value in simplicity, in working towards something real, in living a life where he could find meaning beyond wealth. But the pull of his family's expectations was suffocating. The idea of turning his back on everything his father had worked for felt like betrayal. "I don't know if I can do it," he said quietly. "I don't know if I have the courage to let go of everything." Emma placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. "You don't have to do it alone, Jake. I'm here, and I believe in you. You have more than just the weight of your family's legacy to live for. You have your own story to tell." Her words gave him pause, and for the first time in a long while, Jake considered the possibility that there was more to life than what had been planned for him. But even as he felt a sense of relief in the thought, reality set in. His family wouldn't just accept his decision. There would be consequences that could tear apart the fragile relationship he had with them and the life he had known. "I don't know if I can walk away," Jake said, his voice shaking slightly. "What if it means losing everything? What if I lose my family, my future?" Emma looked at him, her expression one of quiet understanding. "I can't promise you that walking away won't come with pain. But I can promise you that if you stay in a life you don't want, it will be even harder. You'll lose yourself in the process. And no matter what happens, I'll be here." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of something deeper, an unspoken promise that no matter the outcome, they would face it together. Days later, Jake made the decision. He couldn't keep living under the shadow of his father's legacy. He knew that stepping away would be the hardest thing he had ever done, but it was the only way to take control of his life. He called his father, telling him that he would not be joining the company. The conversation was brief, but the silence that followed was deafening. His father's voice was cold and distant, laced with disappointment. "I thought you would make the right choice, Jake," he had said. "But I see now that I was wrong about you." The words stung, but Jake knew it was the right decision. He couldn't let fear of his father's disappointment dictate his future. He had to carve out his own path, even if it meant facing the unknown. In the days that followed, Emma stood by him. She saw the strain in his face, the anxiety over what would come next, but she also saw something else. A new sense of determination, a quiet strength that had been buried beneath the weight of his family's expectations. They spent more time together, talking about their hopes for the future, and slowly they started to build a new life, a life that didn't rely on the riches of his family, but on the work they put into it, the choices they made together. But just as things seemed to settle into a new rhythm, a new twist emerged. Jake's decision had rippled through his family's business, and they were not about to let him walk away without a fight. His father's lawyers had already begun to take legal action, trying to claim control of his personal assets and investments. The battle was just beginning, and Jake found himself once again on the edge of a fight that would force him to confront his past and possibly lose everything in the process. Emma, ever the grounding force, stood by him, her support unwavering. But even she couldn't predict how far Jake's family would go to keep him in their world. As Jake prepared for what was sure to be a long and costly battle, he realized that no matter what happened, the decision he had made was one that had set him free. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and obstacles, but for the first time, Jake felt like he was living for himself. And with Emma by his side, he knew he was no longer alone in this fight. The true test of his courage had only just begun. As the weeks turned into months, the consequences of Jake's decision to step away from his family's empire began to unfold in ways he had never anticipated. What had seemed like a simple choice, an act of personal freedom, quickly became a drawn-out battle, one that tested every ounce of his resolve. His father, furious with his refusal to join the family business, had not only disowned him but also used his considerable influence to try and strip Jake of everything he had worked for. Lawyers were dispatched, and court battles ensued. Jake's personal assets, his investments, and even parts of his family's estate that had been passed down for generations were all up for grabs. The legal war was both emotionally draining and financially crippling, and it became clear that his family was willing to do anything to reclaim control over what they had built. Through all of this, Emma stood by his side. She could see the toll the battle was taking on him, how the stress was eating away at him, how he wrestled with the weight of his decision every day. Jake had always prided himself on his ability to face challenges head-on, but this was different. This wasn't a challenge he could win by sheer determination or by throwing money at the problem. He was up against his own flesh and blood, and the stakes were much higher than any business deal or corporate strategy he had ever encountered. At first, Emma had tried to be the rock Jake needed, offering emotional support, encouraging him when he seemed ready to give up. But soon, even her optimism began to wane. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he had started withdrawing from her, as though the burden of the fight was becoming too much to bear. He had always been the one to help others, to make things right, but now he was the one who needed help, and it was starting to overwhelm him. One night, after another long day in court, Jake returned to the small house Emma had rented for them, a modest place compared to the sprawling mansion he had grown up in. He was quiet as he entered, his face drawn, his posture slumped. Emma didn't need to ask how his day had gone. She could see it in the way he moved, in the shadowed look in his eyes. She had always known that the decision to walk away from his family would come with consequences, but seeing Jake like this, broken, defeated, exhausted, made her question whether it had been the right choice after all. "Jake," she began, her voice soft but filled with concern, "you need to take a break. You can't keep pushing yourself like this." Jake didn't respond at first. He walked to the small kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, staring out the window at the darkened sky. The weight of everything, the court cases, the family's rejection, the mounting pressure to fight for his own future, had become almost too much to bear. "I don't know how much longer I can do this, Emma," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I think we're getting closer to a resolution, another obstacle pops up. My father, he's relentless. He'll never let me go." Emma moved toward him, her expression softening as she reached out and touched his arm. "But you've come so far, Jake. You've already made it through the worst of it. You're stronger than you think, and whatever happens, we'll figure it out together. You don't have to do this alone." Jake turned to face her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to find the strength he had lost somewhere along the way. He knew she was right, that he couldn't keep going down this path on his own, but there was a part of him, a part he had been holding onto for so long, that didn't want to let go of the fight. His pride, his sense of duty to his family, and the fear of losing everything were powerful forces that made him second-guess himself at every turn. But in that moment, as he looked at Emma, he realized that the fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was about them, about the life they had started to build together, the hope they had kindled in each other. The future was uncertain, but the one thing he was certain of was that he couldn't go back to the life he had come from. He couldn't let fear or family control his every move. "I don't want to go back," he said, his voice steady, though tinged with a vulnerability he hadn't shown before. "I don't want to live in that world anymore, but I don't know how to let go of it." Emma smiled softly, squeezing his hand. "You've already let go, Jake. It's just a matter of realizing that you don't need that world anymore to be happy. You have everything you need right here." Jake nodded, though the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on his chest. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight, and no matter how hard the road ahead might be, he had someone by his side who believed in him, who wanted to see him succeed on his own terms. That was something he had never had before. But the battle was far from over. As Jake and Emma began to make plans for the future, they knew that there was still much to be done. The legal fight raged on, and Jake's family continued to use their influence to make life difficult for him. They played dirty, pulling strings behind the scenes, attempting to sabotage his efforts. But with every move they made, Jake and Emma found new ways to fight back, using the knowledge and resources they had at their disposal. They didn't have the wealth and power of his family, but they had something more important: determination, and each other. One day, just as they were beginning to think that victory was within reach, a new twist emerged. Jake's father, in one final attempt to force him back into the fold, made an offer, one that would change everything. He proposed that Jake return to the company, take his place at the head of the business, and in return, all the legal battles would be dropped. His family would accept him back, and he would be restored to the life he had once known. Jake's mind raced. It was the ultimate test, an offer that would solve all his problems, but at a cost. To accept would mean abandoning everything he had worked for, everything he had fought for with Emma. It would mean betraying not just his father, but everything he had come to believe in. The choice was clear, yet still, the weight of his decision was immense. The night before the final meeting, Jake sat alone, staring out the window, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and fear. But then Emma joined him, sitting beside him in the quiet stillness. She didn't need to ask what was on his mind. She knew. And she also knew that no matter what decision he made, it would change everything for both of them. "Whatever you choose, I'll be here," she said softly, her hand resting on his. "I believe in you, Jake, and I know you'll make the right choice." Jake looked at her, the love and gratitude in his eyes stronger than ever before. In that moment, he realized that the true fight wasn't just about winning the battle or defeating his father. It was about choosing the life he wanted, choosing the person he wanted to become, and choosing the future he wanted to share with Emma. It wasn't going to be easy, but with her by his side, he knew he could face anything. The next morning, Jake made his decision. He walked into that final meeting with his father, not as the son who had to live up to expectations, but as a man who was ready to forge his own path. The offer was tempting, but it wasn't the life he wanted. He refused it, once and for all. The road ahead would still be difficult, but Jake had taken the first step toward the future he and Emma were building together. They didn't need his family's fortune or legacy to be happy. They had each other, and that was worth more than anything money could buy. And with that, the fight was over, not because they had won in the traditional sense, but because they had chosen to define their own future, free from the weight of the past. The weeks following Jake's decision were filled with uncertainty, but for the first time, there was also an overwhelming sense of freedom. He and Emma, though unsure of what the future would hold, had both made a choice, one that would define their lives moving forward. It wasn't easy. The aftermath of rejecting his family's offer didn't come without its own set of challenges. The legal battles raged on, and Jake found himself in a constant state of flux as he worked to protect what little he had left. His father was relentless, continuing to use every legal and financial tool at his disposal to make Jake's life as difficult as possible. But something had changed in Jake. The pressure, the fear, the overwhelming weight of his past. It was still there, but it no longer held the same power over him. For the first time, he was living for himself, not for the expectations of others. He was writing his own story. One afternoon, while Jake was working through some paperwork at a local cafe, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Emma. "Come to the farm. I have something to show you." Jake's heart raced as he quickly gathered his things and made his way to the farm. He didn't know what to expect, but after everything they had been through together, he knew that whatever it was, it would be important. When he arrived, he found Emma standing in front of the barn, her face lit up with excitement. "I got it," she said, practically bouncing on her heels. Jake frowned in confusion. "Got what?" Emma held up a piece of paper. It was an official document. "The farm's debt has been cleared. The bank finally approved the loan application I put in. We're going to make it, Jake. We're going to save the farm." Jake's jaw dropped. He had been so focused on his own struggles that he hadn't even realized Emma had been working behind the scenes to secure the future of her family's land. She had taken matters into her own hands, seeking financial assistance in a way that was smart and calculated. The loan she had secured wasn't just a lifeline for the farm. It was a symbol of her independence, of her ability to create a future of her own making. He stepped forward, his eyes filled with disbelief and pride. "You did it, Emma. You really did it. This changes everything." Emma smiled, her eyes glinting with pride. "We did it. Together." Jake could hardly believe it. After everything they had been through, facing off against his family, battling the weight of expectations, the court cases, the endless hurdles, here they were, standing on the brink of something new. The farm was safe, Emma's dreams were within reach, and Jake had found something far more valuable than wealth or status. A sense of purpose, a sense of belonging that had eluded him for so long. For the first time in months, Jake could breathe easy. The legal battles with his family were still ongoing, but the threat to Emma's future had been neutralized. And more than that, Jake had finally embraced the idea that his future didn't have to be dictated by the past. He didn't need to be tied to the family business, to the wealth and privilege that had defined his existence. What he needed, what he wanted, was a life of his own making, a life that wasn't controlled by anyone but him. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of new beginnings. Emma and Jake, both now free from the pressure of their respective burdens, threw themselves into the work of rebuilding their lives. They worked side by side on the farm, tending to the crops, repairing the barn, and creating a plan for the future. Jake wasn't just a visitor anymore. He was a partner, a true equal in the hard work that went into making the farm a success. His skills, though not honed in the same way Emma's were, began to shine in unexpected ways. He had the business acumen, the knowledge of finance, and the drive to help Emma transform the farm into something even greater than it had been before. They spent late nights talking about their dreams, about the future they wanted to create, and the life they wanted to share. For Jake, it was a revelation. He had always been taught to aim for power, to amass wealth, but now he understood the true value of hard work, of purpose, of creating something meaningful. He was no longer chasing the illusion of success that had been instilled in him by his family. Instead, he was building something real, something grounded in love, effort, and shared goals. The farm became more than just a place. It became a home. Not just for Emma and Jake, but for anyone who needed a place to feel welcome. Together, they started a small community project to support local farmers, helping them secure loans, share resources, and create a sustainable network. Emma had always dreamed of a better future for her community, and now, with Jake's help, that dream was beginning to take shape. But even as their lives started to stabilize, the shadow of Jake's family loomed over them. His father's anger had only grown after Jake's refusal to return to the family business. The legal battles were far from over, and every step forward seemed to bring a new challenge. Jake had learned to face these challenges with a new mindset, though. He didn't face them with the same sense of dread that had once defined his existence. Instead, he faced them with a sense of purpose, knowing that no matter what happened, he had already won in the most important way. One day, while walking through the fields with Emma, Jake stopped and turned to her, his expression serious. "I've been thinking a lot about the future," he said, his voice steady. "And I want you to know, no matter what happens, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I'm in this with you." Emma smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. "I know, Jake, and I'm in this with you too." It was in that moment that Jake realized something profound, that the journey they had both been on, the battles they had fought, had led them to this place of understanding, of mutual respect, and of deep, unconditional love. They had faced incredible odds, but together, they had come out on the other side stronger, more certain of what they wanted from life. The road ahead would still be filled with challenges. There would be more legal battles, more obstacles, and more tests of their resolve. But for the first time, Jake felt ready to face whatever came their way. He no longer feared losing everything, because he knew what truly mattered: his future with Emma, their shared vision, and the life they had built together. No amount of wealth or status could compare to the happiness they had found in each other. And that, Jake knew, was worth more than anything he had ever been told he needed. As the sun set over the fields, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jake and Emma stood side by side, looking out at the horizon. They didn't know what the future would hold, but they were ready to face it together, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they could overcome them as long as they had each other. Their story, full of twists and turns, had led them here, together, stronger, and more determined than ever to build a future based on love, purpose, and the belief that anything was possible. And in that moment, Jake knew that this was what it truly meant to be free.